Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for what should be another one of those very important sessions. Now, I've had the tremendous privilege over the years that I've been doing interviews to interview some of the biggest names out there. You wouldn't believe it because I do have a small channel, but in reality, I was the first to interview Gert van den Bosch. Everybody knows about him. I was one of the first to interview Dr. Shetty. Everybody knows about Dr. Shetty. I was also one of the first to interview Dr. Malone. And so, in that period of time, I have had some really huge interviews that I think changed the way the whole understanding of the pandemic went. I think today this is another one of those. Now, in truth, it's about statistics. How can that be interesting? Well, it's about what it means to you and how the pandemic and the future pandemics are potentially manipulated for the sake of politics and finance. And what we need are voices who are able to identify when it occurs and to try and support educating the public about it. So, my great pleasure is to have Regina with us today, and we will be discussing some of those realities based on what she has seen and what she has modeled. So, just a little bit of housekeeping, just a reminder to you all to look in the description below and for all the links, courses, books that we're working on, as well. There's YouTube membership, just to let you know if you're a member. I see your posts and comments straight away. So it's another added advantage for you to join in with that. So before I start, I'm going to do a slightly different introduction to Regina because this is such an important one. So let's start with this. What a brilliant introduction. And so, without further ado, I'd like to add Regina. Wonderful to have you, Regina. As I was explaining, I heard you speak recently. And when I heard you speak, I thought to myself, the world needs to hear this woman. Okay, that was my thought. That's why I immediately tried to get in contact with you. And I said, listen, Regina, I'd love to have the opportunity for you to share your work. So let's start off with some basic stuff. Just for the sake of the audience, can you introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, first, I'd like to thank you for having me on, Philip. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my story and what I've been doing. My background is I have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Physics and a Master's and PhD in Statistics. Years ago, I did work for a private economics consulting firm here in Ottawa, Ontario, that specialized in risk-benefit analysis. And during that time, I became very familiar with the government's risk management framework. So I could speak to that, and I could see right away that they were not following that when the pandemic hit. Years ago, I was involved in a serious incident where my legs were crushed between two vehicles while trying to while putting groceries in the trunk of my car. And at that point, it did have a major impact on, my career and my future, like my life. I basically put rehabilitation and health first, took time out to attend to my family and to focus on um, basically the dreams, health, and aspirations of my children and my husband. And that's where I was at when the pandemic hit.
Wow, wow. That's tremendous. And it really sets the stage for something I guess people don't quite I asked myself when I saw the work that you had done with regards to the statistics. Most people, if they get home from work after long hours, they can't be bothered to look at anything else. But your mind was clear. You were able to try and analyze this simply because you were in a place where you could. So when we look at the pandemic, when it started and you started to do that kind of analysis, which you do naturally, what were your thoughts?
Well, it kind of came from left field here in Canada. Like, we had heard about the pandemic, but we were just, life was going on as usual until March when they announced the pandemic and that they would lock down immediately. So that was a really drastic measure. And obviously, it caught a lot of people off guard and it created a lot of panic. And I am a worrywart when it comes to my family and my children. So the first thing I wanted to do was assess what the risk was to my kids and to myself, my husband, family, friends, that sort of thing. So right away, I went online to see what data I could get, what was available to try to assess the risk that this pandemic, this new virus, posed to us. And it was a really easy analysis. I was actually surprised at how much information was available right off the top. It's like, wow, they already have all these stats and all what's going on from around the world. And when I looked at it, it was clear at that point that this new virus was not a huge risk to myself, my family, my children, anybody who was, any non-elderly, like basically it was posed a risk to the very elderly and those with comorbid conditions. But for most of the population, it was manageable risk. And for children, it was extremely low risk. And so I was actually comforted. I was like, okay, this is going to be okay. My children are safe. Children are safe. And that's my number one concern as a mother. My husband and my siblings will be fine. Most people will be. And my attention went to my parents because they were in their 80s. My dad had several comorbid conditions. So a lot of my focus went to making sure that they were set up in a safe way as we moved forward. I was shocked at the lockdowns and the school closures, given what we knew right at the start, that seemed to be moving in the wrong direction. And that really concerned me. I understand the government's risk management framework, like I said, and they seem to be moving away from that. And as time passed, it became more obvious that they weren't using their own risk management framework. And instead of trying to minimize harm and risk, it almost seemed like they were trying to maximize it. So I became very concerned early on.
It's fascinating that you said that, because I think people forget what they were thinking at the beginning of the pandemic. It was blatantly obvious who was the primary risk, so much so that they were talking about trying to protect Granny. I mean,
Mhm.
so there was a very clear understanding as to where the risk was. Somewhere along the line, something started to change. And where do you think that was?
Oh, that's a difficult one because to me, when I looked at the data, I mean, there was some uncertainty, but it was pretty clear, like you mentioned, where the risk was. And as time went on, it became even more and more clear that we didn't have to, like the majority of the population wasn't at high risk. That just became more obvious. Uh, right away, the government acted in a very panic mode type of way. And when new information came about, they didn't course correct. They just kept going down the same wrong path. So they are actually consistent in what they did. They kept going the same way, and that was to instill panic and fear amongst the population. And when information came out showing that it wasn't as deadly as they said, instead of trying to use that and reassure the public, instead they came up with new ways to promote fear. So I'm not sure if they really changed or just got worse as time went on.
That's very interesting, I mean, it raises some. I mean, now when you look back, because I think because I was looking at it similar to yourself in terms of understanding what was going on and trying to understand why did certain decisions occur which didn't seem to make any sense. Well, is it that they just don't understand, what is happening? And so I can see that pattern that was evolving. And so at that time, it was, okay, they're doing the lockdown and so on. When we start to shift into the end of 2020 and we're going into 2021 now, and we're starting to see the vaccines come through, what were you thinking from a risk benefit kind of analysis from the statistics?
When I was looking at this initially, I could see a massive statistical manipulations. So I was concerned about that. And a lot of these manipulations were coming from our public health agencies. So I was very keen on following what was going on. And I guess into the fall of 2020, where there was more and more talk about the new mRNA vaccines. And so I started reading studies about mRNA technology and past experimentation and where that was. And that concerned me greatly because it seemed very clear to me at the time that that technology was not ready. And yet they were talking about bringing in vaccination by December. Um, and it was also clear that they can't possibly have any, mid or long term data showing the risks or the ramifications. So that was an issue to me. So as we journeyed to, December 2020, I had already been talking to my family and my siblings about the new technology coming out, and that even if the case was that these vaccines were safe and effective, which they had no way of really knowing they would be safe since they didn't have the data. But even if they were, most of the population didn't need them. Like, we were not at risk. The children were not at risk. The, people my age who are healthy were not at risk. So I did not see any reason for us to take this vaccine one at all. And certainly without knowing the long-term safety, it just didn't make sense. So that's where I was when the vaccines started. Right away, when the clinical trial reports became available, I did read them. And at that point, I became more concerned. There was a lot of red flags in the clinical trial reports. And at that time, I was already, like I said, I'm very open in my family. I was already talking to my children. I was already talking to my siblings about what that meant.
You mentioned about the original trial, and I too remember looking at the data there. And I subsequently did a reanalysis of it, and I went back to the data because by that time we had the full study, and I got into trouble on social media for highlighting that the cutoff date was November the 14th in terms of mortality around it. And I then just calculated that if they had shifted that cutoff date to December the 19th, the mortality would have been completely different. Just 1 month. I got into trouble for saying that. But I understand what you mean in terms of there were concerns straight away that something is not quite right. But this was then pushed forward onto the population.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could acknowledge the high risk because they didn't know, they were concerned about them. I had thought that they shouldn't do anything with people who are already infected. If somebody hadn't been exposed, okay, reasonable to take a risk. Would that have been a reasonable risk benefit analysis at that time?
Well, I would start with the children. When I look at children, there was never any real benefit for any kind of vaccination for the children for COVID-19. They simply were not at risk, serious risk at all. So I never found there was any reason for children to be taking it. For adults, again, for much of the population, if you're not at serious risk, why would you take an experimental drug? When you look at the elderly, there you may have a case. At the elderly, you look and say, okay, what is your risk from this new virus? And what is the safety profile of these drugs, and is it worth that risk? When it comes to new experimental drugs, that should be up to the individual whether they're willing to take the risk, and it's up to our agency to properly express what that risk benefit looks like. And they didn't. They did not convey the risks, and they forced it on the population. So that was a huge concern. And they started off with focusing on the elderly and our healthcare professionals. And I was really concerned about that because, I had two siblings in healthcare. So, I felt that they should not be forced to take this experimental vaccine.
Yeah, well, so it raises the question then, because you were in Ottawa in Canada, and
Yes.
that happened to be the center of a global vaccine mandate challenge with regards to the truckers Did you go down to the protests?
I did go down to the protest because I live in Ottawa. I was able to get there pretty fast, and I went down 13 times. I wish I could have went more, and I did try to go more, but then the Emergencies Act came in, and we couldn't get down there. Um, it was a fantastic celebration. A lot of people had been isolated, and at the time, the unvaccinated were being treated horrifically, and myself and my family, we were going through a really harsh time. It was I can't even express the state we are in when the truckers came, and it did give me a lot of hope, and I'm grateful for it. Um, but up to that part, my family had gone through a lot of harsh treatment. We had my two older kids were in university, and they did not take the vaccine, so they were not allowed to attend university. They were kicked out of their varsity sports. Um, my husband, he works for the federal government, so the federal vaccine mandates uh, impacted him. I have actually almost all my siblings were impacted with the vaccine mandates one way or the other, either through working for the federal government or for healthcare. So we were going through a really rough time.
And so that difficulty inspired you to do something very few people would do, which is that, you know what, you said, you know what, I'm going to take on the politics. What happened in your head at that point?
I became increasingly concerned about where things were going in Canada. In the spring, they started talking about, um, oh, it's so ridiculous. In the media would start off by saying, oh, they would never mandate these vaccines, would they? And then there was talk about it being unconstitutional, which it was considered unconstitutional before the fall of 2021. And as soon as they start talking like that in the media, right away, I'm like, oh my God, they plan on making these mandated. So then I started looking into the Constitution and what was going on then, and I became more and more worried. And it looked like a lot of the politicians were on board with vaccination. There wasn't a lot of opposition. They started talking a little bit about requiring certain people to take vaccines. And I remember on Canada Day, I went to Parliament, and a leader of the People's Party of Canada was speaking. And the People's Party of Canada is basically a libertarian party. They were against vaccine mandates. They were against the lockdowns. They were for accountability and responsibility. But they were talking at that time, and I thought, well, they are the one party who was opposing a lot of the nonsense that was going on. And shortly after seeing them there, I heard word from the universities that my kids would be required to take the vaccines in order to go to school and in order to play sports. And then shortly after that, in August of 2021, Trudeau ran for re-election, and he made vaccine mandates a wedge issue. So he campaigned on bringing in vaccine mandates for federal workers, travel restrictions against the unvaccinated. He paid provinces to bring in the vaccine passports. Um, and so almost in a fit of desperation, I jumped into the politics to oppose those measures, and I ran for downtown Ottawa, which is Liberal NDP territory. So in downtown Ottawa, there's a lot of support for Trudeau. So my message was not welcomed, but I knew that, but I ran anyway because I felt this was a huge, I just couldn't believe Canada was going down that road. I thought it would be a permanent stain on Canada, and it's something we should never do, is to mandate these experimental injections and to ostracize a huge portion of the population. Yeah, so I ran into politics.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, I think that's an inspiration to people in the sense that if you don't like what you're seeing, become the change. I mean, that's tremendous. Now, sadly, you didn't win.
There was no chance of me winning. Like realistically, there was zero chance that I could get a seat. But it was downtown Ottawa, and a lot of people look at the politics in downtown Ottawa. So I knew it was important for somebody to speak out in that riding. and to have a voice. So I was hoping that I would bring awareness of the issues and that maybe they would win seats elsewhere in Canada. So it wouldn't be me who'd win a seat, but I was hoping for some kind of representation in Ottawa to fight vaccine mandates, and not just the mandates, but the lockdowns and the path that we were on.
So, when we now think about it, because we're going to look at some of your statistics in a little bit, what do you think was the major change that stopped the mandates?
That stopped the mandates here in Canada. So the issue that they were having is that during the pandemic, they were manipulating statistics basically to push their narrative. But they ran into problems when Omicron hit. When Omicron hit, we seen that a lot of the vaccinated individuals were actually catching COVID. And here in Ontario, the Ontario data, it actually showed during Omicron that the vaccinated had higher incident rates than the unvaccinated. So that was a real problem for the government. And around
Is
that
this
time,
the image here? Sorry, I'm just going
no,
to
go ahead.
add this in.
Okay, this is perfect. So if you click on this, you'll see this is the timeline in Ontario from when Trudeau called the election to when the Emergencies Act was called for the trucker convoy. Can you click it? Maybe it will show the next slide.
Oops, sorry, wrong way. This
Oh,
one?
yeah. So here we go from Trudeau calling the election all the way up until the Emergencies Act came in. So Trudeau calls the election. He campaigns on vaccine mandates and he ramps up the rhetoric against the unvaccinated. They were really vilified in Canada. It was horrific. And unfortunately, he was reelected. Then the provincial passports came in. And what that did is it banned unvaccinated people from most public venues. And that was followed by vaccine mandates for federal public service, so that if you were not vaccinated, you could not go to work in the public service. So a lot of people were put on leave without pay during that period. And then the unvaccinated were banned from planes and trains, even in our own country. So I could not, say, take a plane from the province of Ontario to Alberta, say, to visit my daughter. And if you had a funeral on the other side of the country, you could not take a plane and go to that funeral or see a dying loved one. So, and they were very strict with that. There was no compassionate grounds for compassion there. So if you didn't have it, too bad. You can't see, you can't visit someone in dire straits at the other end of the country. Then Omicron hit, and at that point, 80% of Canadians were vaccinated. And then you see that the vaccinated, their rates, their cases just spiked. It went way up. And so Ontario, the province of Ontario, and other provinces locked down again. And instead of admitting that these vaccines did not stop transmission, instead what happened was the rhetoric against the unvaccinated increased in Canada. And they started blaming the small portion of unvaccinated for these huge spikes. And Trudeau even brought in more restrictions. These restrictions, more restrictions were brought on unvaccinated truckers. That sparked the Freedom Convoy. And that convoy was very successful in that it put pressure on the provinces to relent on their vaccine passports. And they started to do that. They started started ending their vaccine passports. But the federal government did not want to end its mandates and travel restrictions. So that's when you see Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act to stop the protest, stop that momentum, so that he can maintain the vaccine mandates and travel restrictions. So
And just
that's
to make it clear here, the green is the unvaccinated,
no,
way above
no,
the purple.
the green is the vaccinated.
I mean, the vaccinated, sorry,
Yes.
way above the unvaccinated in purple here.
Right.
Wow. And this data came from where?
This is from the Government of Ontario official website. So the Government of Ontario's own website showed that the vaccinated had many, many more cases. So that graph you see there was cases. The issue was, like I said, Trudeau and Trudeau's government did not want to end their mandates. And there was a lot of pressure put on his government because around the world, people were ending their restrictions because it looked like the gig was up, but not here in Canada. But there was a lot of pressure to, on them to still get rid of these mandates even after the Emergencies Act came in. And at that point, they got really desperate. And that's where you see a lot of so-called government experts doing things that basically would be classified as fraudulent science. And that's where Fisman comes in.
Okay, so let's introduce Fisman here, and so I'm first explain who he is, and I will put up the slide that shows the links.
Okay, so Dr. Fisman, he's at the center of this slide, and I would describe him as Canada's frontman for pandemic modeling. So he came into the picture very early on. Before the pandemic was called, he was given a grant to do modeling for this pandemic. So in February of 2020, he was already brought in to advise the government on what was going on with this new virus. And throughout the pandemic, Fisman advised all levels of government here in Canada. He advised at the municipal level, he advised at the provincial level, and he advised at the federal level. So he is very influential in our response. And his background is that he is a physician and he's also an epidemiologist, and he does mathematical modeling. But he also has many, many conflicts of interest. Not only was he advising the government, but he has a lot of ties to pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and so on and so forth. And he also advised on different tables, for example, the Ontario Nurses Association and the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. And this was an issue, if you look at the elementary ETFO, that's the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, they wanted to continue with school closures. And Fisman argued on their behalf to keep the schools closed at the same time that he was advising the government of Ontario what to do in the pandemic. So there was a conflict of interest there where he's getting paid by the ETFO to advocate for closures at the same time he was advising the government of what to do. So there's massive conflicts of interest.
And so this here then led to the situation. And what's interesting is that because this was mirrored across the world, the reason why you are so important, Regina, is that you have done the work that reflects the reality in every country in the world. So what it must mean is that there is a Fisman in every country.
Well, Fisman was a big part of that whole pandemic of the unvaccinated narrative. And so that narrative, you did hear that around the world. It wasn't only Canada saying this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. You had a lot of clips here of Biden saying such a thing, and in other places around the world. And there was a lot of modeling throughout the pandemic to try to show that it was the unvaccinated that dominated the cases and the rates. The issue here in Canada was when we had the Omicron hit and real world data showed basically the opposite. They weren't willing to drop it here. So Canadian experts, Fisman, they went the extra mile to try to counter real world data. And so what Fisman did is that he and his colleagues from the University of Toronto, they concocted a model to simulate fake data to show the opposite, fake data that would show that it was the unvaccinated who had higher cases and the unvaccinated that had disproportionately more infections. And the issue is they try to pass that simulated fake data off as a true reflection of what has happened. So they modeled the Omicron wave, but they flipped reality so that they can cling to that false narrative that the unvaccinated were a risk to others.
And so this is what it looked like. I'm just going to go to your next slide here. So this was the reality.
That's the reality
Yeah.
for the Omicron curve. Yeah, and this is
So
the
we can see
cases.
that they vaccinated. This is all about infection cases. The
Yep.
unvaccinated are down here. But what was then put out was this.
That was Fisman's study, basically. Yes, he flipped it and made it look like when he wrote his paper, for example, there was an effort to make it look like it was based on real world, based on real people. So that was the issue. And if you go to the next slide, this is cases, but the next slide shows the rates. So you have vaccinated, unvaccinated. You see a third line there that I don't have, but that's partially vaccinated. All right.
Mhm.
But he doesn't talk about partial vaccination in his paper. He's very vague about what defines vaccinated and unvaccinated. So we have the vaccinated rates here are higher than the unvaccinated rates. And then Fisman simulation flips it again. And then it went out. This study was publicized everywhere in Canada and abroad. Okay, it went out even to like New Zealand. It went out to Australia, even India. And the headlines warned of the risks of merely hanging out with the unvaccinated. And
You
this was
know,
after Omicron.
so this is now here's the bit that I'm trying to understand. How is that statistically possible?
What do you mean? How is it statistically?
Did
Which
they just
part?
make up the data? I don't
Oh,
understand.
what's shocking is that it would be published in a peer-reviewed journal and that the institutions would stand by it. So when this study came out, a lot of researchers wrote to the journal and said, what is this? This is opposite of what real world data is showing. This study needs to be corrected or retracted. And they were warned that people believe this to be true and they think it's real. So the journal was giving a lot of negative feedback from this study, but they did not retract it. I went a step further and I wrote to the University of Toronto and I asked them to investigate the researchers and to call for a retraction. And they refused. And I had provided absolute proof that it was fraud. I wrote a huge critique and I sent them the proof and they just closed the file. And after that, I went to the federal funding agency because this study was funded by the feds. Our federal government funded this study through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And I asked them to investigate both the University of Toronto for not investigating the researchers, but also investigate the researchers. And I also asked them to correct the record because within 4 days of this study being published, it was waved around in our federal parliament, using it as a justification to extend the travel restrictions. So a Liberal MP from Trudeau's government waved around this study and said, oh, look, the unvaccinated continue to pose a disproportional risk to others. We need to extend our travel restrictions. And they did. And I asked the federal funding agency to set the record straight. And the presidents voted not to investigate and not to set the record straight. That's what
So
happened here in Canada.
and again, as I said, because clearly this modeling would have then passed around the world, as you'd said. And so governments around the world would look at this coming out of Canada, a reputable university, peer reviewed document. This, therefore, they would run with. And you would then see a ramping up of that narrative, even though it was false. But the question I'm trying to understand is how is it possible that the statisticians who are in place all over the world didn't pick this up? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it is possible. It is they had to know what they were doing. That's part of the reason I went even further after this. I actually went to the policing agency here in Ontario. I went to the anti-rackets branch of the Ontario Provincial Police and I asked them to investigate because this was a textbook case of scientific fraud And that shows intent. You cannot make up data, pass it off as true, and not know you're doing it. It's impossible. And they were given absolute proof, and they stood by it. And I've given them every opportunity to correct it, and they will not do it. So I went to the policing agency and I asked them to investigate. But they would not investigate this. They were fairly hostile, and it was at that point I decided to write the book. I'm like, well, it's not okay to be doing this because the ramifications are huge. I understand why they don't want to admit this and why they continue, because this, having the unvaccinated have disproportionately greater infections and being the driver for infection is their central argument for vaccine mandates. And without it, there's no justification. If this vaccine didn't stop transmission or even curtail it, and now there's evidence that it actually makes people perhaps more infectious, more likely to catch it, well, that completely obliterates the justification for vaccine mandates, and they don't want that to happen. So and it does worse than that. It shows that when the real world data proved that these vaccines did not curtail transmission, they were willing to commit fraud to convince the population otherwise. It is very, very damning. And so many people are on board, we're on board with it, that they're doing everything they can to keep that alive. They don't want to admit wrongdoing. They don't want to admit it's fraud. The repercussions going forward are too much for them. And I have to say that since my book came out, it's gotten even worse, because instead of admitting they're wrong, these researchers actually publish an updated version of their model where they cling to that false narrative. They actually cling to it. And that update came out in February of this year.
So, as I said, what's remarkable now is that the world has seemingly moved on. Booster uptake is at its lowest rate ever. So the public are voting with their feet. They're not buying into that narrative at the moment. But there is a perception that, okay, it's just because of the variants why this is happening. But what you are saying and what the statistics seem to have been showing is that once Omicron hit, that was the end of any kind of even slight benefit you could argue about all the way in December of 2021.
Yeah, and I actually argue more than that, because when I look at the timeline of this pandemic, it was known before the mandates here in Canada came in that the vaccines did not stop transmission. And we knew in the summer of 2021, when Trudeau was campaigning, that the vaccinated were just as likely to transmit as the unvaccinated. Studies were coming out of the CDC and out of the US, and it was, we knew back then there were issues. And when I look as a statistician, when I look at the data manipulations, I could plainly see that they were there to try to push the narrative that the unvaccinated had higher infections and worse outcomes. So you could see the data manipulations throughout. So it wasn't just Omicron. There were issues. You could see it. It became obvious to me during Delta that they had big problems. And then Omicron hit, and it completely obliterated their narrative, or it should have obliterated their narrative, but they continued anyway. And then shortly after, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just asking the question, what is going on? What is this narrative? What is the purpose of this narrative? Is it politics? Is it finance? It's certainly not health of the population.
Oh, it's not health. The pandemic, from my perspective, well, you can show that it was purely political, and yeah, it had a lot to do with wealth. And it may appear that people have moved on and they're not buying into this future COVID-19 vaccines. But in Canada, our politicians have shown that they haven't changed course at all. There's just more legislation coming in that will make it easier for this to happen in the future. So the legislation coming in here is more censorship on so-called misinformation, which is anything that the government doesn't like. They're talking about more centralized power, which will bring in less accountability, less transparency, and more reliance on their pandemic experts, which in your introductory video that you showed shows that Canada's pandemic experts have, when needed, just flipped reality to continue with the false narratives. So we're bringing in legislation here that just makes all that easier. And also there's going to be a push for us to share with, internationally with different countries. And so that's an issue. So if you look at Fisman, for example, he was Canada's frontman for pandemic modeling. He engaged in scientific fraud, but instead of being reprimanded, he now sits at the helm of the modeling and strategizing unit for the new Institute for Pandemics out of Toronto. And their goal is to be global leaders in pandemic modeling. And Fisman is the lead for that. So that's a huge issue.
It's almost scary because we are seeing numbers going across the world. I tell you, one of the things that really bugs me is to do with what happened, say, with monkeypox. When monkeypox was spreading across non-endemic regions, and just in case people didn't understand, it normally is about 1,000 to 1,300 in the Congo in Africa. There were 88,000 cases in that period of time in non-endemic regions, in highly vaccinated regions. And my question was a very simple one. Of the people who had monkeypox in non-endemic regions, what percentage of them had a COVID vaccine? There is no data. They will tell me everything else. They will tell me their sexual history, whether or not they're telling PrEP. They will tell me everything else, but they will not share that. And this is what I mean. And I keep on saying to people, it's not whether or not it's important, it's just data. Because if you're going to exclude data, it means that there is an agenda as opposed to a clear intent to try and get to the understanding of a condition. You bring all the data you have and look at it and analyze it. This is very, very concerning. We're on the brink of what's happening with bird flu, and we keep on hearing about it. And so suddenly, if there is this kind of fraud in existence at this level, what does the population do? How do they believe anything?
It's a major problem. Like when you look at Fisman, it was complete fabrication. So it's easy to see. It's easy to see that that's fraudulent. What's more difficult is when they falsify real world data, or they manipulate real world data in ways that aren't legit. And that's what you see for most of the pandemic. And they control the data. So we're at a huge disadvantage. So when they manipulate the data, they're not giving us the information we need to prove their manipulations are wrong. Well, for the most part, I'm actually able to do with some of the examples are obvious. And the examples that I provided in that video that you showed, I chose those examples because I can absolutely prove that those manipulations were wrong. In the case of Fisman, it's fabrication and outright fraud. But even in the case with mask mandates and also the Ontario Science Table, the manipulations they did, I would argue that they falsified data, and that is also scientific fraud. And because of my background, and also I scoured the internet way back machine to find the information I needed, I can actually show what they did. But the issue is that they do not provide a lot of the information we need to make informed decisions. They, they
I want to ask you a question. This is slightly different, and so I understand you haven't had a chance to look at all the data, but I'm just going to show you something here. This was something I spoke about recently with the weekly deaths in England, the 13th of September 2024. And this is relevant because there was a politician, Andrew Bridgen, who was raising the concern about excess deaths in the UK. And you can see here that they said that the number of deaths registered in week 37 was 14.4% lower than normal. Okay, so saying there is no excess deaths. But when I looked at the image itself, where did it go here? You can see that these bars, which represent the average, are much higher than they were the year before because they have changed the statistical modeling strategy for excess deaths in the UK. Is that the kind of example where you can play with statistics to get outcomes that are in line with government policy?
so these are difficult questions because what people have to realize is statistics is very highly nuanced. So you have to understand what they are measuring. So you sent me this file about the UK and the change in definition in or the methodology in which they calculated excess deaths. So I just kind of went through it quickly to see what they did. And it looks like previously they were looking at pre-pandemic baseline and comparing it to what was happening pre-pandemic. And they've recently changed the baseline to just be looking at what's the death trend over the past 5 years. So it's a different baseline. And when I look at this, you have to understand what the metric is being used for. So if you are using a metric to, to try to estimate what you think the excess deaths will be, then it makes sense to have a metric that aligns with that. So if you look at pre-pandemic and that's your baseline, and now you're showing that over the last several years, you have underestimated the excess deaths and they're actually a lot greater than you thought, then you would need to change your metric in order to use that for going forward what you actually think that the deaths will be, if that makes any sense. Like if you want to actually prepare for, how is the population changing? You need a good, more accurate estimate of how many people you think are going to die. So they've changed their metric, but it can be misused. And I think this is the issue with the politicians, right? You have to watch out how you use the interpretation. So if you look at the excess deaths and say, less people died than we thought, so everything's okay, that's the wrong interpretation. So when they report excess deaths, they should be reporting it a little bit more responsibly. For example, you could say, the excess deaths were less than we thought based on the trend over the last 5 years. And then people think, wait, but we had a pandemic over the last 5 years. So the fact that we have less excess death does not mean everything is good. It just means compared to the trend over the last 5 years, it's less than we expect. That's very different than saying the excess deaths are more or less than what we thought based on pre-pandemic. So there should be a slight explanation as to the meaning, but I see that was missing in the reporting. They're just saying, excess deaths are less than expected. No, they're less than expected based on the trend over the last 5 years, but they're higher than expected based on pre-pandemic levels. And that's key. So, yeah. And you see this a lot, a lot, you especially in statistics, you need to define what it is you're measuring and how it's being used, because during the pandemic, all I see is a constant misuse of statistics.
It's very important, because I think that one of the problems that we're having at the moment, as I mentioned to people previously, trust in doctors has dropped 30% in 4 years. And that's probably reflective of trust in science and scientists has dropped probably by a similar or even a greater amount. And it's because people are seeing that what they are saying is not correct. So either they're fraudulent or they just don't know what they're doing. Is there any other interpretation that we can have?
One of the big issues I have is that there's this they've used throughout they've used throughout the pandemic the excuse that they didn't know, or it's the best thing that they could do. And I look at the data, I see intentional manipulations to push a certain agenda. And it is not believable to me that your top experts don't know what they're doing is wrong. Like, I find that completely unbelievable. It's just not a believable, it's just not plausible. It isn't. So when I look at the manipulations, and you want to say that top experts did this and didn't know, I don't believe that can be possible. And I would strongly argue that it's not possible. And that's what I'm trying to do now. That's what I do in my book, that they had to know. But even with that opening video, I can make a very, very strong case that they knew exactly what they were doing when they pushed those lies. They knew.
Wow. And so, where do we go from here? Meaning that one of the strangest things that has happened out of this pandemic, and I was recently just annoyed where every time somebody tries to go, okay, well, people misinterpreted what we're saying. I'm saying, no, 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 you are just wrong. You just didn't know what you're talking about and don't want to acknowledge that you were wrong. That's a different issue. You need to acknowledge that you are wrong. The problem is, those same people are still in the same positions. I often argue that if this was a financial company, this is equivalent to them losing, say, 50 to 60% of the profit of something of the company. Can you imagine them still being in the same position? It's unbelievable.
Well, you're right. They can't have it both ways. They either did not know legitimately, in which case they should be fired. They should not have those positions. You can't be an expert and be completely lost on pretty obvious things that any competent person could see. You shouldn't hold those positions, or you have to admit that it was intentional lies. So that's where we're at going forward. I mean, I'm nervous about what's happening here in Canada. Like I mentioned, they're bringing in legislation to make this type of manipulations just easier going forward. And the government is pushing for more censorship and more trust in their experts. So I feel that where I need to go is to show that we cannot simply trust the government's hand-selected experts, because these experts, you can show there are experts that committed scientific fraud. And so I do feel that I have to go in that direction to show that we can't allow that to happen. We can't give them more power. They should be given less power, and we need accountability. I mean, I have several thoughts about how to go about that, but I can only work within the means that I have. So my background is statistics. I can show statistically and make a very strong case that we need to protect ourselves from this going forward, and that they intentionally lied. Is that enough? The more I look at it, the more I realize we as in the people who see that wrong has been done, we need the backing of people who have the financial means to push certain things forward. When I'm looking here in Canada, more and more I'm seeing that we need, many people talk to me about the possibility of private prosecution of some of the people to hold them to account. Um, I that would take a lot of money. It would take a criminal lawyer. I actually think we do need to go there in order for this not to happen again. I actually think we do need to start pushing back at strongly on some of these researchers who committed these horrible acts of scientific fraud, because the consequences have been massive. But to do that, that would take more than just me. You need people on board who have the ability to help with that endeavor. that's where I see. But I do think it's necessary.
I want you, Regina, can you pick up your book here a minute?
Oh, uh, yeah, my book.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah.
So there you go. And I just want people, oops, sorry. No, 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 hold it there. Hold it there. Hold it there. I just want people to eyeball that book. The link is in the description for Amazon. And there's a reason why I want people to do that. And the reason is quite simple. It's clear that across the world, this was why I said your voice was so important. You represent actually a form of a freedom convoy because nobody else has done this. Nobody else in the world has gone and collected all this data and is able to show categorically that this is fraud. Now, what needs to happen is that the question needs to be asked as to how every single country didn't see that this pattern was evolving, because it would have been exactly the same in the US, in the UK, in Australia, across Europe. The same pattern would have existed, and so therefore it suggests that this level of fraud is in existence across the board. And so the point is that everybody now, wherever they are in the world, needs to get the book, needs to get the pressure on that this has to be reanalyzed statistically and the truth has to come out.
Well, yes, and just to emphasize that, after my book came out, like I mentioned, the researchers updated their model. But that updated model actually went into a an international journal headquartered in the US. So I actually wrote to the US journal as well and outlined, what was wrong with the update and also the original model and the fraud and how it played out in Canada. So they have full knowledge of what's at stake and how bad things are. And they have not retracted it. And I've gone back also to the University of Toronto and to the federal funding agency, because our federal funding agency continues to fund knowingly fraudulent fraud and the researchers who are doing this. And what I've done is I've collected more evidence showing that they are doubling down, and it's getting worse. So I actually wrote I have the accomplices here, and this provides all the letters and the back and forth communications with these organizations that shows that they know what they are doing. They know it's wrong, and they continue to fund it, and they get caught in more and more lies. And so that's what's going on here. And these studies, like you said, they're not just in Canada. The masking studies are ridiculous. If I can just mention that first graph that was in that video, that first graph is for a masking study. And what the modelers did here in Canada, in Ontario, they looked at Ontario data in 2020, and the trend was that we had no mask mandates in the beginning of 2020, and at the end of 2020, we did here in Ontario, and you see an increase in cases. But these researchers want to show that mask mandates were beneficial. So the first thing they did was adjust the data so that the trend looks opposite. All right. So
I've got it. I just wanted to show it. This is why. So this
is
pretty much,
Ontario. Yep.
yeah.
So in 2020, you had no mask mandates in the first half. Then over the summer, mandates came in. And then at the end of 2020, you had your mandates. And this is just, Government of Ontario data. That's just how it is. It doesn't suggest that mandates made things worse, but it does show that the data does not look like they made things better.
And so then it then became, what was this here?
So then this is the adjusted cases. So what happened was that the researchers applied I call it a fudge factors because they basically said, had Ontario Ontario would have done more testing and equal testing amongst the different age groups, then this is what they think the data would have shown. So it's opposite. But then they modeled their pretend data to get the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes,
the
yes.
issue with this, so yeah, it looks like the mask mandates, oh, they did something, and that's what the researchers use in their study. But what's interesting here is that this study was published in a US journal. The ridiculous methodology was presented at a Yale conference, and it passed that. And then on top of it, if you recall, there was a Cochrane report on masking that came out in 2023 that people were upset about because it basically said there was no, strong evidence showing that masking worked. And
Mm.
everybody's like, oh, this is wrong. So what happened just a couple months ago is there was this international study, 13 researchers from different parts of the world, including, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. 13 researchers got together and said, oh, we did our own narrative review to show that masks do work. And in that narrative review, they use studies like this one I'm talking about, where they reverse the trends and say, hey, masking worked. So you see different researchers around the world embracing this kind of nonsense, this kind of ridiculous modeling, and it passing peer review in different countries. So yeah, it's not limited to just Canada. And I will say
Wow.
that, yes, Fisman was part of that narrative review.
So as we come to the end here, Regina, this has really been insightful. Um, I guess the question, you kind of answered it before, but there are many people who are watching this now, and they feel powerless as to what can be done. They feel that there's nothing they can do. But I have learned from just listening to you is that when you feel powerless, what you did is you decided to take on the politics. So, what do you advise people to do now?
It's true. When I felt powerless about what they were doing to my children in the school, I did step up and run for politics. I knew I wasn't going to win a seat, but my voice was heard. I made sure it was heard, whether they liked it or not. And with the Fisman study, when I saw that, I knew right away I had to say something because I could, because it's my skill set. I looked at my personal skill set and I said, based on my knowledge, I can prove that that is fraud, and I can prove the statistics that were used during this pandemic were manipulations to push a false narrative. And I do believe that that's powerful. So I looked at my skill set and decided this is what I could do with it. Different people have different skill sets. You have independent podcasters coming out and bringing me on and other people to inform people. So they're helping to combat the censorship. That's their part. That's what they're good at. And so I think everybody has their own skill set that they can draw on to help out in this fight. Even if you just say, I'm not going to follow nonsense, that's strong. That would have been so powerful in the beginning. If we had, if more people said, no, I'm not going to listen to these ridiculous measures. I'm not going to lock down. I'm not going to wear the mask. If we would have been more forceful, then it wouldn't have gone to this degree. Also, I think one thing that I would strongly recommend is for people to become more aware of the manipulation techniques that have gone on and how this was done. There was a huge behavioral science component to this, massive propaganda, and I think that we need to become more aware of these techniques going forward. I know in Canada here, they have a whole new behavioral science division to continue using that going forward. So the techniques are shocking. I think people need to be a little bit more well aware of that. I'm not
Excellent,
sure if that's a
excellent.
good enough.
Yeah, so here is it on Amazon. Well, one of the books is Fishman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science, and The Accomplice as well. So I guess that they would be able to find that. That's your way of becoming educated in the science and at least being able to raise awareness. So I'm encouraging people to make sure that they support you in that journey. We really appreciate what you're doing, Regina. I think that it is very important. I'm tremendously honored to have you, and I hope that this is the beginning of a wave of scientists who stand for truth getting into the positions that they need to be. Why can't you be the new Prime Minister of Canada?
Uh, yeah, I think
Yeah,
we're a long way from that. I'll
the
be
long
happy
way.
if, yeah, I'll be happy if Trudeau steps down. That's already an issue. But the person coming in his place would have to be someone who wants to take a real look at this. And there's always hope.
There's
Uh,
always hope.
there's
So
always
just
hope.
stay with me for the outro. Thank you again, Regina. Thank you for the audience for being with us. And we look forward to bringing you more informative interviews in the near future. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip.